Welcome to the Veritas podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Jodi Shaw. Jodi is a musician, whistleblower, and founder of the Integrity Matters support group for artists and entertainers trying to survive and thrive in the age of wokeness. Jodi, thank you so much for joining me on the Veritas podcast.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Yeah, I've been excited to talk to you. I've been familiar with your story, particularly as it pertains to what happened at Smith College and all of that for a while now. And I've wanted to talk to you for a while. And I'll start off by asking you kind of about yourself and your story and everything that happened and how it was you found yourself becoming a whistleblower for these racist, discriminatory practices that are taking place under the guise of, diversity, equity, and inclusion, something that sort of your situation reminds me slightly of the one that occurred at Evergreen College in 2017, but it is a little different. But in your own words, if you just want to talk about kind of your story and how you ended up in that position.
Wow. Well, it was a long process. Let's put it that way. It wasn't just one thing that happened. It was a culmination of events, and not just things that happened personally to me, but things that happened to me against a backdrop of a campus in which many, many other things were happening to other people. So there was an environment, it was a hostile environment in which individual things happened to me. So it made those individual things all that much harder to speak about. There's a lot of fear, a lot of eggshell walking. But very briefly, to kind of set the stage, there was an event on July 31st, 2018, in which a Black student went into a house during the summer. And at Smith, they refer to houses, the residence halls are called houses. So that's what I mean when I say house. A student went into a house to get a meal, and she was not assigned to eat at that house. And the house was in fact not even being used for overnight accommodations. It was like a day summer camp for children. So she was literally out of place. And so at that time, Smith staff were told, when they see someone out of place, who don't do anything, just call campus police. And that is what the janitor, a white janitor who had been at Smith for over a decade, maybe longer, with an unblemished record, did. Campus police responded. There was a very nice interaction, which the student videotaped. And the news went viral. She posted to her Facebook that evening, and it went viral. It was like an international news story, and it was referred to as sleeping while Black. Like, it had been interpreted as a racist incident. And the college responded as if it were a racial incident and went into overdrive, announcing its intention to implement policies and procedures to address this racism and systemic racism and all this stuff, so on and so forth, even before it had investigated the facts of the matter, which it then did. But by the time the report came out showing there was no wrongdoing and this was not an incident of bias, or no, they said this was not a racial incident. By then, the college had already set into motion all these programs, and it kept going. And it said the president, in response to the findings, said, "We cannot rule out individual bias," or something like that. So she was still implying that it had been a racial incident, and thus justifying all of these new programs and policies for staff actually, and then later I think for faculty. And this is not an uncommon pattern, I guess. This has been pointed out to me by journalists. There's like an incident that happens on a campus, and then the campus just goes way overboard in responding without even really trying to find out what actually happened. There's no due process, essentially. It's just assumed. And this assumption is based on this other assumption, which is that society or culture, I would say society is, what's the word? Rigged, I guess, for white people and against everyone else. And that's just an undeniable objective fact. Which totally ignores context or nuance, context is always shifting. Power dynamics are always shifting, but this is kind of a fixed way of looking at the world. And so through this particular lens, then of course what the janitor did is totally wrong and obviously racist, because whenever something happens between a white person and a non-white person, which is I guess, impolite way of saying person of color, then it is interpreted as somehow a racial incident. So anyway, sorry, I just had to set the stage there. So that is the
Yeah.
backdrop. I had just started working at the college about a year prior, and I don't even know where to begin with, but a series of things happened, both individually to me and to other people on campus. I saw other things happening, um, which ironically, as much as the college would push for honest conversations about race and authentic discussions, and we know it's hard, but we have to talk about this, made it actually very hard to talk about race. If you argue that that's even appropriate to be talking about in a work context, which I would argue it's not. And so I came to a point about 2 years later where I was told, I was under this barrage of you have to come to this meeting and talk about your race, you have to talk about your identity, other fixed and immutable characteristics, and which really had nothing to do with my job.
Mhm.
I mean, they would say it has, and through this lens that they're using, the social justice lens, it permeates everything. But to a sane, rational person such as myself, it did not pertain to me giving out keys to students or getting them
Yeah.
cards. Clearly, these are not related things. Um, so when I was told in fall of 2020, no wait, it was fall of 2019 that I would be attending a workshop in January 2020, and I would be asked to discuss my race. I thought to myself, well, gee, you know, you're not supposed to ask about race in a job interview. That's illegal. So how is it that this could possibly be a continued condition of my employment to
Mm.
discuss my race at work? It doesn't seem right to me. Doesn't seem legal. I'm not a lawyer, but um, so I told my supervisor, I approached her and I said, I don't feel comfortable talking about my race at work. And she said, no problem. You don't have to do it. Just say you're uncomfortable when you go to this workshop, and just tell them that. So that's what I did. I was the only one. I mean, there was literally a question like, please, we had to go around the table. This is in front of my colleagues. It was a required workshop, or it was called a retreat. And we were asked, please tell us about your understanding about your race within the context of your childhood. So now we have two things I don't want to talk about at work, at a formal work meeting. And I declined. I just said I'm uncomfortable doing that. And I was the only one to do so. And a little later in the workshop, one of the hired facilitators said, we want to be clear that any white person who expresses discomfort talking about their race when requested is not actually uncomfortable. What they're doing, it's called white fragility, and it is a power play. So this was essentially a public shaming, and I did feel
Yeah.
shame. I did feel shame. It worked. I felt shamed, and I also felt very angry. And so that was my line. So after these couple years of being around this and walking on eggshells and always feeling bad and confused, I finally decided that my line was not only just you must think this, because that you can kind of avoid. You can just refuse to think it. How are they going to know? But you must now speak the words that we want you to speak. You can't speak other different words, because if you do, it's going to be implied that it's a power play, and thus
Mhm.
somehow an act of aggression against your colleagues who do not share your skin color or whatever. So that was the line. It was really compelled speech. So I went to file a complaint, and it was obvious when I went to file the internal complaint at Smith that it was going to be handled differently than a complaint lodged by somebody who does not have white skin. That was very clear. There were several statements made that an email memorializing that. And so, but I filed the complaint anyway, and I exhausted my internal remedies. Um, During that time, right after I lodged the complaint, George Floyd died. And that set into motion another whole hyperdrive
Yep.
of Smith College. We're going to combat systemic racism, and we're going to do it by starting on our campus by telling our staff you have to do X, Y, and Z. And this, you have to remember, during this time, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. People are getting put on furlough, and the college is telling us they're going to prioritize these programs, which cost money. This and justifying this bureaucracy that it's building, this monster of salaried positions to support these racial justice initiatives at the same time as staff are being furloughed. So that was just, I mean, it got worse that summer. And I sent a Hail Mary email. I sent a lot of emails saying, hey, I lodged a complaint. Now it's getting worse. Like, what's going on? And what's the outcome of the complaint? So I decided when I was not getting a response from that Hail Mary email, which was sent to several members of the president's cabinet, that I had to go public. And that culminated in a video on YouTube. And I honestly thought at that time that, okay, they're not listening to reason and logic. They're not responding. Perhaps I knew that they don't like publicity. So I thought, well, if I put some public pressure on them,
Yeah.
maybe they'll pay attention. The president had never reached out to me before then. And they did pay attention, but they did not seek to remedy their ways. In fact, they just sought to distance themselves from me. And that's kind of the history. I ended up, they put me under investigation for an unrelated matter. Clearly it was pretextual. And then I ended up resigning because at that point it had become so hostile. Obviously, I was now a pariah. And the college had contributed to making me a pariah. So that's it. I resigned and here I am. I filed a complaint with the EEOC, which is the first step everyone has to go through in an employment matter. If you're filing a Title VII complaint, which is a Civil Rights Act, Title VII, you must go through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission first. And so that's what I did, and that has concluded. And I am now preparing my complaint for a civil filing.
Yeah. This story strikes me as incredibly impactful, and unfortunately it is all too common. You're one of very few people who has very publicly come out to talk about this sort of thing, but it's happening a lot more than people realize. I was an undergrad a few years ago and ended up in a somewhat similar situation when I was in the College Democrats, and I spoke out against a lot of the campus free speech issues that were coming up in 2017. There was a big hullabaloo and people tried to protest at a College Democrats meeting. And the thing that I'm sure we can relate on, Jodi, and I wanted to talk to you about to start, is the feeling of alienation and the incredible level of hostility that you're subjected to when you speak out on this sort of thing. And the way that I want to frame this question to ask you, Jodi, is what do you think it is about you, because there's many people who find themselves in this type of situation, actually, but hundreds or thousands across the country, especially at colleges and universities, but only a very select few really kind of dig their feet in and actually stand their ground to the point where they'll eventually end up talking publicly about what happened and, you know, being in a sort of open conflict instead of just sort of giving in. Most people give in at some point leading up to that process. They go, okay, you know what? I don't want to be a social pariah. I don't want to deal with this. What do you think it is that made you in particular, or makes people like you? Because there are other examples. I brought up Brett Weinstein earlier as a good example. What do you think it is that separates the person who kind of gives in from the person who digs their feet in and says, no, this is wrong, I'm going to keep fighting?
Wow, Scott, this is a question I have been asking myself for a long time. And I think about this constantly, and I see other people asking this question. And I wonder what the percentage is too. I've heard different percentages. I've heard 10%, I've heard 30%, I've heard 2%. You know, that is people who know. I think what we're talking about is not the true believers, like people who think there's nothing, that this is entirely all goodness. We're talking about people who know something. There's people who like know something's wrong, but they're not quite sure, and then they feel confused because it's supposed to be good. Maybe that means they're bad. And then there are people who well, clearly this is ridiculous and there's something very wrong here. It's not just ridiculous, it's destructive, but I'm not going to say anything. And then I think you're talking about those people and the
Yep.
difference between them. And I mean, I didn't say anything for a long time. I just, why was my line compelled speech? I honestly think it has something to do with being a creative person and really feeling attached to the ownership of my own speech.
Hmm.
I've sometimes think it's a genetic mutation, but it's the words that come out of my mouth, it just never feels good. And I'm guilty of saying things that I don't think are true. And it never feels good. And it just always eats away at me for a long time when I do that. And it's so hard. I think the pain of lying, which is essentially what you're doing when you go along with this and don't say anything, the lie is living through you, as that guy Havel said. That the pain of that, there's a pain, was greater for me than the pain of becoming a social pariah. I think that's really what it was for me. And also, I think maybe that's just tied into a total intolerance for bullshit.
Yeah. No,
I can't stand it.
I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head as far as I'm concerned. I've always described it as some people, I don't know if they're born with it or they're probably not. At some point in their childhood or in their adolescence or in their young adulthood, people come to a place where they develop, one way to say is an intolerance of bullshit. And I think I definitely share that with you. But another way to say it is a strong desire, perhaps even a need to respect and seek out the truth, and to have the truth be an important part of their identity, and to not build their identity around known falsehoods. That is something that, especially over a long period of time, will cause a lot of inner turmoil and pain for actually a very select and small number of people. I've come to the finding personally that unfortunately far fewer people than I thought growing up really give a damn about what is true and what is not. It's more so about what is comfortable to most people, which is very ironic considering that they always claim, we're going to try and make you uncomfortable, but really it's very comfortable as long as you're willing to say certain things in those spaces. But and it alludes to something that I bring him up on the show all the time, but why not? Because he's such a great person. Dr. Jordan Peterson has talked about the fact that you come apart when you tell falsehoods and you know that they're false. And I want to ask you, how do you think you can get more people in, let's say, I've taken to just calling it the woke orthodoxy. How do you think you can get more people in that group who are at least aware that they're speaking these falsehoods, to see that in the long term? Because in the short term, they feel this level of comfort, right? They feel like in the short term, I'm not going to have to deal with these personal conflicts or these workplace conflicts if I just keep saying the line. But how do you think we can get more people to see that in the long term, joining the sort of heterodox coalition that allows you to be yourself and tell the truth? And I always like to bring up, tell jokes and have fun. This has come up with Dave Chappelle recently. How do we get more people to see that joining that group will, in the long run, be better for you socially, emotionally? Because it is. I've certainly found that it is. How do we get more people to see that rather than just say, okay, I'm going to cocoon up for the short-term gain in my little tribal safe space?
Well, it's interesting you bring up Dave Chappelle because I have a theory about this. I don't think you do it by talking to them and reasoning and up evidence and logic and look, like, I know this feels good now, but it's going to come for you, and it's harmful to your psyche, and when you're on your deathbed, so on and so forth. I think there is some misery in, like, it is comfortable, as you put. It's more comfortable because you're going to get your paycheck, you're not going to be ostracized, but it's not total comfort. There is some unease, right? And but for some reason, some people are better able to kind of push that away or live with it right? The reward is greater than, so there's still that unease, I think. And I think, and there's fear of saying the wrong thing. Clearly, we've seen many examples of people we thought were true believers who have been ousted and made into pariahs in spite of their best efforts and apologies to kind of get back in. So I think there is some misery in going along with it,
No.
and fear. And so I think when you see other people, when other people can create situations in which you're like Dave Chappelle, for example, if you look at his audience laughing, they're laughing. It's like, wow, they're having a good time and I'm not.
Mm.
Like, maybe I want to be having a good time. If you can, this all comes down to culture. I mean, as an artist, the best way I can tell it is a story. So if artists or the people who create culture, because this is a cultural revolution and a matter of culture. If we can build, there are lots of people who are defending the fortress right now because the fortress is being dismantled because the fortress is viewed as racist or bad or whatever. So there are people defending it with logic and reason, which is great. But we need people who are actually like building the fortress too, and polishing the stone and building it up and making it beautiful, and connecting with each other while we're doing it. So we have a community, because part of how the social justice and the woke stuff works is to debilitate communities, disable your ability to have a healthy community. It's not healthy when you're always afraid of your own community and you're afraid you're going to say the wrong thing. You don't know who to trust. So, as these people come for the fortress, my theory is that they'll look up and they'll see all these artists on this building this amazing beauty, and the site of this fortress is just so beautiful that they drop their weapons in awe. And they think, wow, it's so beautiful. This is way more beautiful than what I just came from. And look at these people who are working on this fortress. They're so happy and they're connecting and they're laughing, and like, I defect. I want to be inside that fortress. I'm defecting from these people. And that's that's not a matter of like pushing and arguing it. It's a matter of attracting them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a matter of us, unfortunately, I hate the us them stuff, but people who are committed to authenticity and honesty and want real things and beauty and truth and laughter and comedy and sports, and spiritual aspirations and connection, that we really dig into those things instead of arguing. We have enough people arguing, that's good. Dig into those things and make them truly good and really fulfilling for ourselves. And if that involves building a parallel culture, then so be it. That's already happening. And then when these people who are unhappily going along with the comfortable life get a glimpse of that and see how happy we are, my theory is that it's like a capital theory. We have more capital. We have more happiness and joy and beauty. I just can't help but think that joy and beauty and authentic connection are always more attractive than what's happening over there, for lack of a better word. I don't know. That's my theory as an artist.
Yeah, I think there's something to this. It's the idea that maybe you take a more subtle and indirect approach to trying to sort of, turn things a little bit culturally in the other direction. It reminds me, I don't know if this is kind of what you're getting at, Jodi, but it reminds me of how if you see a video of like Jordan Peterson being assailed by a group of, I don't really use the term SJW anymore because it's just kind of it's like an old meme, but like that kind of person who is, going after him. And you see the way that he responds to it, and you see the way that they approach the situation. You just sort of get this innate sense of like, who do I feel like identifying with in this situation? Or the better example, and we've already talked about this, is Vito Gesualdi. Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing his name. I forget how to pronounce his name, but he was the guy who went to the Netflix headquarters to counter protest the Dave Chappelle protesters. And he was just standing there kind of, having a good time saying like, I love Dave Chappelle. I think jokes are funny. I don't know if you've seen this video, but yeah, he's standing there. He's a YouTuber comedian guy, and he's very funny. I haven't watched his stuff in a while, but it was very funny. He goes there and he just says, I think jokes are funny. I love Dave Chappelle. And he's just holding up his sign that says jokes are funny. And he's hilarious. He's just this goofy dude. And all of the the I don't know what they're, the kind of like queer trans activist class at Netflix who had walked out, they went out and started screaming at him. Like literally there was this one woman who was screaming like, shame on you, motherfucker, shame on you. That she's just screaming that in his face and banging a tambourine in his face. And one of them breaks his sign. And the funniest thing, it's like a real life SNL sketch. You couldn't make this up. They broke his sign and then they said, he's got a weapon because he had the stick. It was unbelievable. Yeah. So anyway, the reason I bring this up is because it makes me think that it's kind of like what you're talking about, where you see that video and you see him and you see them and you go, I identify so much more as a person who appreciates humor with this guy who's just kind of having a laugh at the expense of these insane people than the people who are engaging in actual violence. They take his sign, they break it, they shove him away. And I think that, I bring up Jordan Peterson a lot, but he was such a good example of when a lot of, I hate to use this language, but it is kind of relevant in the context. A lot of points were being scored in the heterodox column during, I call it 2018 often, like the year of Jordan Peterson, because it was, he had been around for a couple of years in the public eye before that, but he exploded in 2018, and his content and the content of his speeches and people trying to shut down his speeches exploded in 2018. And I think a lot of people saw the contrast between him, a man of incredible character. I mean, I always say that about him. He's just a man of incredible character. And then the people who stood against him, and they just thought, okay, who do I want to identify with here? And I think it woke up a lot of people to kind of what is the best kind of group to associate with long term.
Yeah. I think you get what I'm saying. Jordan Peterson is a good example. He's my hero.
He's a hero to us all, frankly. I mean, he's one of very few people who's managed to kind of create a big glitch in the matrix, and that's what it comes down to, is busting through the wall, the smoke screen that they put up.
Yeah, he's definitely a person that can't lie or can't. I think the pain of lying is intolerable. So he has to tell the truth.
Yeah. I want to ask you about another aspect of the type of situation we're describing that occurred with you at Smith College and is occurring across the country. It's something I definitely didn't want to leave out of this conversation because I don't feel like it gets enough attention. In order for that type of situation to arise, whether it's your situation or Brett Weinstein's situation or any one of these situations where it's centering largely around race, there's a certain fallacy, I refer to it as at this point, called the power plus prejudice model of racism that is employed by the kind of woke folk, whatever you want to call them. And it is the idea, for anyone who's listening that doesn't know, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but for anyone who's listening that doesn't know, it's basically the idea that only white people can be racist because only white people have the power to oppress, and that minorities can't really be racist because they don't have power. They don't have the power to oppress. It instead of making racism a two-way street, it effectively makes it a one-way street that is based entirely on the flow of power, which supposedly goes directly from white people and oppressing onto minorities. This is a ridiculous concept. It is a horrible idea. It has bred no positive fruit whatsoever and has led only to these really bad situations that we find ourselves in. So I'm not going to ask you what you think of it. I'm sure you're not a fan of this concept, but what I wanted to ask you, Jodi, is what is your sort of response to it? Like, what do you think are the best counter arguments to this idea? Because it's something that doesn't get delved into enough, even though it's very important to the people that would say to you, like, because you're white, we are going to treat you differently in this context. The only way they could ever do that is by using this sort of model of what racism is.
Plus power.
Right.
So that whole concept, as you were saying it, I was just struck by the first part of it. I think is probably right. I mean, if you prejudice plus power, right? So, but the second part of it, that only white people ever have the power, is the fallacy.
Mm.
So anybody can be prejudiced. Anybody can say, and that's legal, by the way. You're allowed to have prejudice inside your head against or for anybody based on any reason, including race. The law, there's no laws that say you can or can't think something. So let's get that straight. But when you also have power and you apply that prejudice in a situation where it's hiring somebody for a job, for example, or denying or giving them access to healthcare, then and you're in a position of power to be able to deny them, then and you're using that prejudice against them based on an immutable characters like such as skin color, and saying, I'm not going to give you this that I have the power to give you or withhold based on your skin color. That is prejudice plus power. That's really the way racism is enacted, right? But the argument that only white people are in that position is absolutely wrong, because even right now we have a situation in which the entire culture, like all arms and pillars of our culture, the media, Hollywood, the government, all of our institutions, 99% of them, all higher ed, now K through 12, these institutions have power, and they are using it in a way to enact prejudice against white people. Let's face it. And actually, I would argue it's not just against white people, it's against everybody, applying preconceived notions and saying you can or can't do this because you're this color is so. I'm not explaining this very clearly, but I do believe there has to be some power or formal power involved to actively commit an act of racism. I mean, I guess you could say, well, I mean that there's you could say, get off my land because I don't like your skin color. I don't think that's illegal. Is it racism? Yeah, it's racism. Is it something that a person of color could say to a white person? Yeah. And they would have the power to say, you have to be off my land because they own the land. I mean, it's like there's always power involved in pretty much every human interaction. And that shifts the dynamics always accordingly. But the second part of it is that white people always have the power. I mean, that's just wrong. That's just wrong. It's wrong, and it makes no sense.
Yeah, your point about the actual real power dynamics in our society as it stands is very well taken. I mean, right now we're in a situation where a Black or Latino or basically any person who is not white can take a video of a white person with very little context. And let's say this white person is not being particularly pleasant, but you don't have a lot of context. You don't know exactly why. And let's say hypothetically in this video, the white person doesn't say anything about race. If the person taking the video is a minority and is not white, if they release said video, that white person is very likely, more likely than not, to lose their job. And that is a power dynamic that absolutely goes one way. It does not go the other way. If a white person takes a video of let's say hypothetically just a Black person, just for the sake of argument, getting hostile with them in the street over something, people will be like, oh, well, I want to know more context, which is actually good because that's what you're supposed to do. In that case, that's actually the right thing. It's not a bad thing if you see it the other way around, but that should be, again, I always refer to it as kind of, it's making racism a one-way street. Does that really help anyone? And it's like, no, it takes one group of people, white people, and it makes them unable to take certain situations and contextualize them. Because there's sort of the assumption that, well, the racism only goes one way. And of course, again, people are also kind of obsessed with racism these days, especially after George Floyd. So, and what you said about the institutions is very important. The fact that how could you possibly believe that institutions are racist at this point against minorities when there's only one group you can actively portray negatively in media, and that's white people, especially white men. I mean, that's unfortunately, it's like half the movies that come out these days. All of the white dudes are these bumbling fools, or they're just jackasses, And there's, yeah,
Yeah, that so clearly, I mean, clearly we know where the power dynamic is at this present moment. And amongst just culturally. And the fact that what happened at Smith on July 31st, 2018, the only reason that made international news was not because the campus police officer and the janitor had power or that Smith College is racist against Black people, but because there's so much power in the other direction that in a multi billion dollar institution would just jump and immediately defend and apologize to the student, and not even investigate or contextualize, as you put it. That clearly shows where the power lies, and it not with the janitor or the police officer or even, yeah. That's all I'm going to say about that.
yeah. Well, and I think it extends into other situations. I mean, at this point, I mean, the affirmative action thing when it comes to college applications, that's been a debate that's been going on for decades, but now it's reaching more into, and you kind of talked about this earlier, people's pay scales and whether or not they get hired for certain jobs. I mean, that's like, that's the stuff where I don't know how it's going to survive legal challenges. I don't understand. That is relatively new. I mean, I've been, in and out of the job market in recent years. I've been gainfully employed for a couple of years now, but it wasn't that long ago. I was looking for work, and just a couple of years ago. And I remember seeing for the first time, like, minority applicants especially encouraged to apply, which sounds nice, but the other implied meaning is white people not really encouraged to apply. Like, you can't really say that. Like, if it said whites especially encouraged to apply, you could not put that on a job application on Indeed. That would get taken down very quickly, and with good reason, because it would imply other people not so encouraged to apply. It's sort of reaching this point where it's impossible to ignore.
Yeah, it's impossible to ignore. I don't know if you just saw the Ibermex that the study. I don't know. I don't pay too much. I don't look at these things too closely, but the number of applicants who lied on college application was at Harvard, who said they had some ethnic history that or racial history that they did not, was found to be very high, like almost a third of applicants. And Kendi had tweeted it, but then I think he removed the tweet because people pointed out, like, yeah, doesn't that kind of prove that you're wrong? That obviously things are weighted so far in the other direction that white people are lying because they know it's a disadvantage to be white and just applying for college. And it's almost a running joke at this point, or somebody, one of the faculty members of Smith College expressed it as a running joke, that a white male trying to get a faculty position is a running joke, and that hiring committees will always strive to have one white male as the token. That's the token now, the white male, to make it look like you're, that you're being fair. But yeah, that's where we're at. And for people not to be able to say this, I mean, it's very, very clear to you and me. And I think it's clear to a lot of people, but a lot of people won't say it. They're not allowed to say it because even just naming the obvious is somehow considered, you're racist. You're not supposed to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the penalty that is threatened up to people. I mean, you're well familiar with this, as am I to some extent. The penalties are just so high. It's Brett Weinstein talked about in several of his interviews a couple of years ago. They incur a high cost on purpose to telling the truth because it is something that they do not want you to do. Namely, there's the social ostracization aspect that prevents many people from speaking out, and then there is the employment aspect. I've been arguing lately, I don't know, for me personally, I sort of willingly immolated my friendships with people who weren't willing to tell me weren't willing to listen to me tell my true opinions at one point. I just said, I don't care. If you're not going to be friends with me, I could care less. That for me was not a huge deal. I get much more worried about my employment status. I mean, my name is not actually Scott Veritas. I've said this a million times on the show before. That's not my real name. I do that. It's a name that is it's a cool name, but it's a code name to prevent me from having to answer. It's a nice little code name to prevent me from having to answer to an employer potentially. And and every day I live with the fear that maybe they'll be like, hey, we found a very interesting little YouTube channel, and then we'll see what happens then. But in any case, I bring this up because I want to ask you, how do we address this problem? I mean, it's generally referred to as cancel culture, but that has like a million different meanings depending on who you ask. This problem where there are many people who probably would be willing to speak out on this stuff if it weren't for one of the two main consequences, which is the social consequence and the financial consequence, or in some cases, both. Some people don't want to deal with either of those things. For me personally, the social aspect, I was like, at a certain point, I just said, I'm going to be friends with people who can listen to this stuff. If you can't listen to the truth, I don't want to be friends with you. But for a lot of people, they can't get to that point. How do you think do you think there are legal remedies to that? Perhaps I've brought up lately the idea of maybe we add political expression to religious expression as a protected class in hiring and firing and things like that. Or do you think that it's more of a social and cultural solution that needs to be in place? Maybe it's both. How do you think we address this directly? Because it's something that needs to be addressed, especially if, let's say, unfortunately, I hate to just say a Republican, but I don't think a Democrat is going to deal with this problem in the near future. But should a Republican take control of the government in the next, few years or so, there might be an opportunity to do something. I'd love it if a Democrat did it. I just am doubtful. What do you think should be done about this?
About cancel culture?
Essentially, yeah, about the fact that, do you think there are any legal remedies or social remedies? Do you think that maybe there needs to be organizational support?
Well, if you can prove it was based on a protected class, just skin color, gender, religion, then we need lawsuits. I think legal challenges, we need a lot more legal challenges. There was a guy in North Carolina, I don't know if you saw it, he just won a $10 million verdict.
I did see that.
And he's white. And the New York Post called it reverse discrimination. And as I posted on Twitter, as people rightly pointed out, that phrase is troubling. It's troubling to me as well. It's a phrase that was used with me at Smith when I filed my complaint. I didn't like it. It's not a legal term, by the way. And again, it implies that racism only goes one way, and when it goes the other way, it's reverse racism, when really it's just racism. So yeah, I think we need legal challenges, but I think, what's that saying, that politics is downwind from culture? Is that right?
Downstream from culture. Yep.
Downstream from culture. And then somebody told me that the law is downstream from politics. So if that's true, assuming that's true, and there probably is some truth in that, then we have a real problem. It means we really need to focus on the culture. And so the more, especially cultural icons who do have a lot of influence, or NBA stars, or the more people that speak out and name, or J.K. Rowling's, that name objective reality, that's powerful, because somebody who loves their work, and then, I mean, a lot of people turned on them, of course, but I imagine that the amount of minds and hearts that were changed was not minor. That got people at least to start thinking, like, well, geez, I love this person, and they think that. I mean, even if at first, like, I hate J.K. Rowling, it plants a seed in people. So, because you can't help but like their work. I mean, even Michael Jackson, like Billie Jean, like, you hear the song, no matter what you think about Michael Jackson, this isn't necessarily like the but you can't, your body responds. I mean, some people would deny it. Or Woody Allen. I'm a huge Woody Allen fan. And am I a fan of what many people think that he did? No. if that's true, no, I'm not. I don't like that, but I can't help it. When I watch his movies, they're really fucking good, you know? Like, so I mean, I, I don't know. I feel like I'm going all over the place on this one, but I think legal challenges are very, very important, and I wish more people would bring legal challenges. And I don't know if I should go here, but it feels like there's also a class issue. We just keep coming up.
Mm.
I just keep coming up against this class issue where there are prominent people who clearly might have a lawsuit. They speak out and they clearly might have a lawsuit, but they don't file a lawsuit. And they use their platform, and they sometimes even make more money because they've spoken out about the truth, but they don't file a lawsuit. And I don't know why that is, because I feel like those kinds of lawsuits could be super power. I actually do have an understanding of why it is, but I feel like those kinds of lawsuits could be very powerful because these are cultural icons who now also would be filing a lawsuit. Like that would be like the pow pow, I think. But it would also be, I can't understand why they don't do it. It's hard to already be in the public eye and then to have so much focus on your life, and lawsuits are difficult. Um,
I mean, your point about people, prominent people who are very respected and beloved kind of across political spectrums, who could reach people in every little corner of the sort of ideological compass, if you will, for lack of a better term. Your idea about them speaking out, I don't think that's unimportant. I actually think it's a very good point. I mean, the J.K. Rowling thing was a pretty big moment. I mean, she is really beloved and respected kind of across the board with a certain multiple generations of people, frankly. I mean, she's written the best-selling series of novels of all time, as I understand it. It's like after the King James Bible.
and therefore, I just want to intercede, and therefore she's uncancelable. That was the point. There are certain people who cannot be canceled because their work is so strong. There will always be a demand for it, no matter what their politics are. That was the point I was trying to make. Those are the people like Dave Chappelle. We need them. Even if Netflix canceled him, he's not going to get canceled. He's Dave fucking Chappelle. People are going to go see him. There is going to be a venue that hosts him because they're going to make money.
Yeah, this is such an important point, and the part of it that is painful for me that I see is people do these things. Like I loved it when J.K. Rowling said what she said. I love it that Dave is not backing down in the situation he's in. What's his name? Terry Crews had a moment during the sort of the George Floyd riots where he was talking about how he does not support, discrimination against white people, and he wants people to get along. And of course, he got assailed for that. But the thing that gets me is that, and Dave Chappelle might be the person who's gone the farthest, but people have a tendency to pick a point to kind of back down. They don't really dig in and go and like keep going and stick with this sort of thing. And it takes an incredible amount of courage to do that. I mean, again, Jordan Peterson was an example of somebody who he was kind of a guy who almost became a celebrity through being like, oh, I am going to go 100% in the direction you don't want me to go to. Jordan Peterson was like, I'm going to talk about this stuff all the time. He's an expert in it. And so it really almost kind of got out of hand with him. But I think that the part of this that gets left out of the conversation is there's only so much that people who are uncancelable, as you say, are willing to sacrifice. And it kind of pisses me off, to be honest. I feel like if you have J.K. Rowling, I believe, is a billionaire. Dave Chappelle is hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, these people, the worst case scenario for them is that maybe they have a little bit of trouble finding wide distribution for some of their work, but they would still have a very loyal following and lots of money. They're not going to have a hard time feeding their kids like someone like you or I would have, depending on their scenario. And it annoys me a little bit when they do eventually back down. Like, eventually it was very noticeable that Terry Crews would not continue to speak out the way that he would. I don't want to, go after. J.K. Rowling did a very brave thing, but I would love it if she would talk about it more. Of course, she might feel that she can't because there's only so much she can do before she actually does lose, distribution deals for her remaining novels or whatever. But I want more of these people who are in these positions to actually decide, okay, I'm going to make a real sacrifice. Like I'm going to know that I'm going to lose a Netflix deal or whatever. And I'll have my fallback, which is a hell of a fallback to have when you're in that position. It's like, oh, I'll still have hundreds of thousands of people who are fans of mine and millions of dollars. And to make that sacrifice is the part that gets left out of this. Is Dave Chappelle is bordering on that line where I feel like he's fighting quite hard right now. He has really doubled down, and it's pretty impressive, but he still hasn't reached the point that I wish more people would get to.
Yeah, I think a couple things about, yeah, I agree. Um, I think there's a couple things going on though. Jordan Peterson, I think when you have that many eyeballs on you, um, and then you have people hating on you, um, it can take a toll on your mental state.
Oh, yeah.
And especially if I think if you're a famous person, you're already in a position of constantly having to protect your privacy, and people just always on the lookout for people trying to use you. And it just I think there's stuff going on there that you and I are not necessarily privy to. Um, or maybe stuff going on there that we're not privy to. And also, I think there's something about Jordan Peterson, for example. I mean, his history is he's a Jungian, and Carl Jung was very interested in evil and in general, and where evil comes from and how it operates. And I know Peterson spent much of his life studying how did Nazi Germany even come to be? How did it happen? And the answer is because we are human beings and we are all capable, given the context, of engaging in evil acts. Or yeah, yeah. I mean, this is something I've spent much of my life thinking about as an artist. I think about evil a lot. And I think about context and power dynamics and all that stuff. And I think someone like Jordan Peterson really understands in a larger way where this is going, or he can extrapolate from these steps that are we are actually taking. I mean, even since 2018 we have made some progress here, a lot of progress towards this end that is almost unimaginable, I think, for most people to think of. They think, well, that will never happen here and that can never happen again. It can always happen again. And I think someone like Jordan Peterson, who's been thinking about this a long time, is seeing that very clearly, that we are continuing to make steps in that direction. Will it happen? I don't know. Nobody has a crystal ball, but I don't think it's ever not happened in this fashion for this kind of Western society. And I don't know that. So he's very, very cognizant of where this might go, which maybe, this is just a theory, maybe that knowledge is so horrific that he will do whatever it takes to avoid, and maybe other people aren't as cognizant of that, and maybe there is some comfort thinking, well, even if it does happen, I'll be okay because I have this money. Or I mean, I don't know. I never want to think that I know what people are thinking, because I don't. And I don't know what situations they're facing or why they might decide to stop and think that it's not worth it. But I do think that every voice, like J.K. Rowling, what she did, like, it's a lot. And there's only it can, and I know in my case it can be exhausting. And I think we need more voices. Like if more J.K. Rowlings just spoke out, then nobody would have to like take it and run with the ball the whole way. I mean, when you have the ball, everyone else wants the ball, right? They're going to come after you. It's exhausting. So it's kind of like a relay race, right? Like J.K. Rowling spoke out. Now Dave Chappelle. Like we just keep needing more. We need more of a critical mass. I don't think it's possible for any one individual to do that. I think that's too much to ask, actually. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and it speaks to something that I hadn't considered that I actually think is a very important point, which is that for many of these people, people, there's sort of somebody named Taya Smith, who's been a guest on my show. She introduced me to an idea called the Identity Quake, which is the experience of coming to realize, if you've believed in a lot of this sort of wokish stuff for a long time, that it's actually not true, and that a lot of things you thought were inherently false might actually be true, things that you may have even considered conspiracy theories at one point. And that people go through that process of the identity quake differently, and some people go through it more slowly than others. For me, it was like an 18-month to 2-year process, so pretty long. But I think that what you were saying made me think about how, okay, somebody like a J.K. Rowling or a Dave Chappelle, or I've been thinking about Bill Maher lately, because he's been doing some really great monologues on his show to speak out against this sort of thing. These people are coming to realizations about what is happening at a certain speed, and that I perhaps am not considering that they're doing it more slowly than perhaps I would like. But at the end of the day, there's very little I can do about that, unless I got to, have coffee with them or something and explain a couple of things. But that brings me to my point that I've thought about this in the past, how great it would be to have some of these essentially these powerful elites who are not entirely captured by this ideology, like a J.K. Rowling or a Dave Chappelle or a Bill Maher, and to have them sit down with a Jordan Peterson is the best person, but it could be a Brett Weinstein, or it could be you or me, just somebody who can sort of have a conversation with them about the severity of the situation and the state, what is at stake, especially in the long term. Like, I would love to see a conversation between Jordan Peterson and I don't know, J.K. Rowling. Like, that would be fascinating if they sat down on Joe Rogan's podcast and just kind of shot the shit and maybe got to talk about this sort of thing for just a few minutes even. I've thought about how I would love to have the people who I know people are not a fan, but if you had somebody like a Mark Zuckerberg sit down with Jordan Peterson just to get the perspective on how his work and his choices impact the world in ways that maybe he hadn't considered. Those kinds of connections are so important to me. And I don't think they happen quite enough. Those are big, glitch in the matrix moments. And I don't think they happen quite enough. Joe Rogan is a great platform where they occasionally do. But yeah.
Named a lot. I mean, Joe Rogan, Bill Maher, J.K. Rowling. There's some pretty big, those are power.
Some openings.
Yeah. Yeah, that's big. Yeah, I like that idea. Mark Zuckerberg on Joe Rogan.
Yeah. And to his credit, Jack Dorsey, who is I believe he's the CEO of Twitter, he went on Joe Rogan. Like, I got to give him all the credit in the world. He brought his lawyer he brought his like head of, corporate counsel with him, who took a lot of the questions and had a, debate with Tim Pool. But the fact that he would do that, I was like, I do think that benefits Twitter and that benefits the world. The fact that Jack Dorsey has at least had that conversation probably means there's someone in the boardroom at Twitter who goes like, well, maybe, I don't actually view Jack Dorsey in particular as a particularly malicious figure. I think he might be a little in over his head and he doesn't quite understand the stakes of the situation. But people who are willing to have those conversations, actually, Bill Maher did go on Joe Rogan. I'm remembering now. He actually did. There's a lot of opportunity there. Bill Maher lately has really got me like fired up. I've been like, because it felt like for a while he was kind of out of the picture, if you know what I mean.
He's getting it now. He's got it.
Yeah. He's kind of my new guy where I'm like, oh, he's coming around. Yeah. He's been pretty phenomenal lately.
So as you were speaking, it made me realize with Bill Maher, like, Bill Maher was considered liberal, Democrat, obviously, right? He is now considered by many to be a right-wing nut, white supremacist. So this is also part of the equation. There's a fear amongst many people that they know this is one thing that keeps them from speaking out, is they do not like this thing that would keep a quote unquote disaffected liberal from speaking out, is this fear. It's not even irrational, because it's true, of being perceived of being on the right. It's like an epithet, like, oh my God, it's like a 4-letter word. And that cannot happen. And that is, I think, a big impediment, and including for some of these big name people too, who are maybe super liberal and like Bernie supporters and like, but you can't, if I name reality, I'm going to be thrown in with the right wing, the deplorables, you know what I mean? Like that is like the worst thing that could happen to a liberal. Uh, I don't I don't do that anymore. I think that the left right dance is totally ridiculous, and it is one way that the disaffected liberal, or the new center left as some people call it, is it's really disabling and hampering our ability to put our, meaning everyone who knows this is wrong, to push back at this. It's like it's fracturing, and this fear of people who are on the right or being perceived as being on the right is really disabling. And that's like it's a big weapon that I think, and that we allow that to hinder our ability to organize and push back. And I see even new organizations popping up playing that, doing that dance, because the left right stuff is really irrelevant at this point. This is advanced to now the point. This authoritarianism has advanced to the point of either you're against the authoritarianism or you're for it. There is no left right. There is no left yoga. There is no left right. Just do. There's no this. We're not having policy debates anymore. There's literally this monster in the room, and like we're arguing about, well, who did you vote for? Are you Democrat or Republican? No, 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 no. There's a monster in the room. There's this huge monster. It's like going to eat all of us. So we really need to like come together and push against it. And I think that's one big impediment. I don't think someone like Dave Chappelle, I don't even know what his politics are, and I love that. I because it's irrelevant. And when I made my first video, I was sure to put in it, I'm a liberal, or I'm a lifelong liberal. And a lot of people came up to me and said, that was really important that you said that, because it allowed me to trust you. And so in some ways I'm like, well, I'm glad I did that. But now I'm like, I don't, I understand why people qualify it when they speak out. They say, and I'm a liberal. I understand that. And I understand that's the price of entry to the conversation for many, but I think it's an impediment at this point, and I don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I think that is a very, very important point. And it speaks to kind of the evolution of a lot of people who've become aware of this stuff over the course of the past few years. I'm definitely guilty as charged. I used to be like, well, I am a leftist who is for free speech, and that is my thing. And then eventually, over time, I came to the point where I've said, like, I am not left or right. I am so uninterested in the dance, as you said. I am so bored by that at this point. I don't care at all. I don't read the Politico. Oh, the Democrats and could do the. I am so uninterested in that. I think it's so useless. And this is a great conversation, and we could go for hours. Unfortunately, of all things, I actually have a dentist appointment this afternoon. It's like the worst reason to not be able to continue this type of talk.
Well, good reason though.
Yeah, I gotta go, but it's been such a good chat, Jodi. This is such a great conversation, and I hope we get to chat again in the future. Before we sign off, though, I want to give you an opportunity. Is there anything you want to promote while you're on the show today? Anything you want to draw people's attention to? Your social media? Anything at all?
Oh, geez, I'm always unprepared for this question. I am starting an organization called Integrity Matters, but I'm still working out the details. A lot of details. But you can read more about me at jodishaw.com. I do have a GoFundMe that I'm still using to fund Integrity Matters. And I also do have a lawsuit pending. So I'm going to need to figure out, you'll hear more about that. Yeah. And I'm on Twitter. I'm Smith Surge. Smith. So it's at Smith_Surge, because I thought there was going to be a surge of other people speaking out when I did. Instead, there was a massive retreat. Everybody ran away.
Fortunately, that is so often how it goes. But let's get a little surge going. If you want to check out Jodi on Twitter, check out some of her stuff. Get it.
YouTube channel too. Yeah, just Google Jodi Shaw YouTube.
Absolutely. A lot of people listen to this show or watch this show on YouTube. So if you're already on YouTube, go check out Jodi on YouTube as well. Thanks for coming on to the show, Jodi. If you are listening to the show on iTunes, please leave a 5-star review. If you're listening to the show on YouTube. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks everyone for watching today or listening today, depending on what platform you're on. I'll see you all next time on the Veritas podcast.